So how do you start a podcast? In this video, I'm here with James Mulvany and we're going to teach you exactly what you should do to start a podcast. So welcome to the video. I'm Mark Brown with Editor's Keys and I'm here again with James Mulvany from podcast.co and radio.co. He's an entrepreneur and he's here to teach us how to start a podcast. And if you want to see the last video we did, which is all about should you have a podcast if you're a business, you can see that by clicking up here. But James, welcome back. If you want to start a podcast now, we've decided that we want to start one. Yeah. Really, where should we get started? What are the first two things we should do to get started in recording a podcast?
I think the first things first is you need to make sure you've got good quality equipment. So there's two options. You can either go and buy your own equipment, or you could potentially rent a podcast studio. We have one here in Manchester, but most cities now, if you just Google podcast studio in your city, they're springing up all over the place, and the benefit of that is obviously you get a producer with it, who knows what they're doing. Generally it's kind of sound treated room and it's already got professional equipment. But if you're really serious about it and you want to commit to it, I think buying your own equipment is a good idea. Two options you can go down. If it's just you, a good quality USB microphone. I know Editor's Keys do a bunch. If you want to go a little sort of step up, you can potentially have two mics. So you could have one for you and a guest. You could put them on boom arms. So you could create a podcast studio say you've got a spare conference room in your office. It's a perfect place to set up a studio. And again, I think the main thing to think about is find a quiet space where you're not going to be interrupted. If you can treat it with either put foam on the walls or even just like draw your curtains, that kind of thing, just to stop the echo, it will make a big difference to your recording. But simple things like that do make a difference and it is noticeable. So I think Editor's Keys do some really good options for people who are getting into it. So
yeah, definitely. So we've got some broadcast grade USB microphones, and I think the beauty I think when people start recording, whatever it is you're recording, but maybe especially podcast, is that it can be quite complicated. If you're not an audio person or sort of a creative media type person, it can be a little bit daunting sometimes. So we do some two USB mics, an SL600 and an SL150. And the beauty of them is that you can record broadcast quality vocals, but it's just one USB plug
into the computer.
Straight into the computer.
It works on Windows or Mac.
Yeah.
And it's there's no configuration. You don't need to be a sound engineer to use them.
Yeah.
I think the other thing to mention as well is make sure you have headphones.
Right. Yeah.
Because there's two reasons for getting headphones. Number one, you want to monitor your own levels. You want to make sure you're not too quiet, you're not too loud. Number two, if you're interviewing a guest, and certainly if they're remote, you're interviewing remotely, or if you're being interviewed as a guest, you don't want to have that kind of thing where you're getting feedback. So headphones are absolutely crucial, and a decent microphone. And I think that's really all you need to get started.
Yeah.
In terms of software, there's a bunch of software out there. So on a really simple level, we've actually partnered with a company called Alitu, which integrates with the podcast.co platform. That makes it super easy to actually record and edit your podcast in a kind of really simple building block style way. If you want to get your head into it a bit more, I recommend using some desktop software. So Audacity is free, works on Windows and Mac. If you've got perhaps a subscription to Adobe Creative Cloud, you can use Audition. Yeah. Even on a Mac, there's either Logic or GarageBand, which is completely free again. So there's loads of options out there, and it's really a case of just, get yourself some basic audio editing skills. Not very hard to learn, and certainly if people are used to editing video, editing audio is exactly the same, really. It's the same process. It's just slicing and dicing, taking out the ums and ers, and just trying to create a story that's kind of concise, I think. That's the main thing.
So you could get started with quite a low budget, really, if you've already got your Mac or PC, or even an iPad. Can you record a podcast on an iPad?
Yeah, what I would recommend staying away from is using anything built into an iPhone. So don't record using your microphone that's built into a MacBook or an iPad. Don't record using your iPhone microphone. Yeah. It just doesn't sound very good, and if the audio quality is poor, listeners will fatigue and they won't be able to listen for as long. You ultimately, getting good quality equipment in will make a big difference. And you also, if you're recording it for your business, you ultimately want it to sound professional, don't you? Yeah. And it has to represent your company in a good light. Yeah,
and you kind of want something as well that's gonna be up there for a long time. You don't want to look back in 3 months' time and think, I just rushed that and it sounds terrible. And because I think with the podcast especially, YouTube works a bit differently because it's sort of more of a search engine, but podcast, I guess you can't really go and you can't really replace an episode, or you can't really record the same thing twice. Like
no, I mean, you know, the thing about podcasts is when you release a new episode, it will actually get downloaded to the user's device if they're subscribed to your podcast. So you want to make sure every episode's good, and try and actually get better through time as well. I think when you start, it's like anything, the more practice you have, the better you'll become at audio editing, the better you'll become at presenting, you know, a microphone technique or your interview technique or whatever it is you're doing, you know. So just get your head into it, get started. And of course, you don't feel like you have to publish the first episode you record.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, good point, yeah.
To record an episode, if you don't like it, do it again. And if you don't like the second one, do it again. And you know, eventually when you think, right, I'm happy with that. And the other thing I would suggest as well, if you're getting started, don't just commit to, say, doing it every single week for a whole year. Especially, you know, like you and me, both entrepreneurs, we're busy, we've got businesses to run. It's very hard to sort of commit to that kind of time commitment every single week. So I think try and plan a season. What I do is, say, have a season of 6 or 8 episodes, plan that season out, think about what goals you want to achieve with that season, put it into production, and you know, then schedule those episodes so they're released over a period of time. And using a platform like podcast.co makes it really straightforward, because you can actually have all your content ready to go. You can set the date and time you want it to go out, and it will automate that whole process.
That's really cool. I think that's one fear people have. They, like you say, I'm busy, I haven't got time to do this. And with a podcast, I think especially because you know, like we talked about in the last video, you can have your lyrics there ready. You know, you can be a lot more prepared. I think that's the great thing with them, like podcast.co. You can record them all in half a day. You know, an episode of 6, and that could be 6 weeks worth of content. And I think a lot of people aren't quite aware of that. You know?
Exactly. The other thing that podcast.co does is makes it really straightforward to push it out to all the major distribution channels. So we will submit it for you to Spotify, to Apple Podcasts, to Google, TuneIn, etc., etc. A whole bunch of other apps and services that rely on these networks, because what a lot of people don't realise is when you actually listen to a podcast, say you're listening to a podcast on iTunes or Apple Podcasts as it's now known, that isn't coming from Apple, it's coming from another service. So you need a way to actually host that podcast, and that's where we come in.
So that's what I was going to ask, because I think that seems, to even me, the confusing part. You know, yes, okay, I can get a USB mic, I can plug that in, I can record, I can maybe have a couple of £100 budget or dollars budget. Yes, we've got the free recording software, we've done that part. That sometimes seems like the hardest bit, but then you've got this file. What do we do? Yeah, what do we do with it?
Right.
So talk me through that.
So I'll talk you through the process sort of in layman's terms, so kind of simplify it as possible. So first of all, you need to sign up for a podcast.co account. There's a free trial included as part of that. You then upload your files, so it's really as simple as just dragging and dropping. You know, our site has been designed to make it as straightforward as possible. There's really no technical knowledge needed. You do things like create a title for the podcast itself, write a description, and when you're creating that information, you need to think about it, because effectively that's like SEO for your podcast. So you need to think about how people are going to discover you, what sort of keywords you should be including in there, and really make it as descriptive as possible. So spend some time writing that. And ultimately as well, it's a sales process. You know, if someone's reading the title of your podcast, it should say what it is. So it needs to be clear, especially if you're doing it for business purposes. You know, have a think about what core wants and needs your audience have, and try and sort of formulate a title for the podcast around that that's going to kind of sound interesting, because of course it needs to sound kind of exciting enough for them to listen. But ultimately as well, it's clear what it actually is. So once you've got that, then, you know, effectively that's known as meta information. It's just like putting a title on a YouTube video and writing a description for YouTube. You also then need a title and a description for each episode. You know, it's a case of just filling all of that out on the form, uploading your episode. You can also create cover art for each episode as well. So you have generally a cover for the podcast itself.
And do you think cover art makes a big difference? Sorry to jump in there, but is it a bit like a thumbnail on YouTube? Does that make a big difference, do you think, to your discoverability?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, ultimately, you know, if someone goes into, say, the way podcasts work is they have categories and subcategories. So, for example, there might be a category of video editing, and, you know, someone's browsing through the podcast in video editing. Of course, people do judge a book by its cover. So, you know, it's ultimately going to look appealing visually. And I think, again, if you have the time to create an individual cover for each episode you create, that's going to be good as well, because it just makes it more visually interesting. But then ultimately as well, people do sometimes if they're browsing through, they make a split-second decision on what they want to look at. So if you're competing with 10 other video editing podcasts, well, which one looks most interesting? They'll judge that based on what the cover looks like and also the title and description.
And I will say, I'm not just saying this because James is here, but I've had a look at podcast.co, and obviously the reason why we got you in for these videos is that when I was looking a while back at, kind of doing a podcast and releasing it, the other options out there seem so old and a bit backward, if I'm honest. Whereas podcast.co, and honestly, it's so simple that there's not much to think about. It's just, okay, step by step, I'll put this up here, I'll, like I say, do the titles and the tags, and then really the service does it for you.
Yeah, I mean, when we launched, we wanted to create something that was easily accessible and usable by anyone. The thing is, with a lot of the podcast hosts out there, they're quite dated now. The podcasting isn't a new medium, but it has had a massive resurgence over the last couple of years. So a lot of these companies were basically built back in the late 2000s when, design wasn't the best. People didn't really think about UI or experience, and they haven't updated. Whereas what we've done is come in from the get-go and built it from the ground up to be as simple as use as possible, and just having a kind of really good user experience, nice and clean, and a platform that people will feel more familiar with versus, compared to other websites today versus what websites used to look like 10, 20 years ago.
How long does it take you to make podcast.co and radio.co?
So we were developing podcast.co for about a year. A lot of the underlying technology took a while to build. Yeah. Again, it was very important to us that customers get a super fast experience, that when listeners are connecting, it streams instantly. So there's no sort of buffering, there's no waiting to sort of start listening. So all of that, took a while to sort of come up with. And the other thing as well is making sure that it's compatible with as many services as possible. So there's no kind of friction to get your podcast into as many places as possible. That was really important to us.
Is there any benefit of having your podcast in just like one or two places at all, or is it just good to have it up on Spotify and Apple and everywhere, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, sort of it's interesting because Spotify are relatively new to the game, but they've managed to take a big chunk of the market in terms of listeners in a very short space of time. And certain countries will have more listeners on one platform versus another. Again, Google now have a homepage, so if you go to podcast.google.com, you can see Google's entry into the podcast market. They now have a podcast directory effectively, and they didn't have that 3 years ago.
Right, yeah.
They really only introduced it actually last year. So it's a kind of constantly evolving ecosystem that is very distributed, but ultimately as well, you want to make sure you're in as many places as possible, because you don't know who's listening. And some people prefer using Spotify, some people prefer using Apple Podcasts, some people prefer using other services like Pocket Casts, etc. There's tons of different apps now out there, so you want to try and make sure you're on as many as possible, and we make that process really straightforward. You don't actually have to do anything. All you have to do is say, I want you to distribute my podcast for me, and then we do the rest.
That's cool. And yeah, it's got me thinking, I mean, if you're on a regular website, it's very easy just to flip between different video platforms, but if you listen to, say, if you just have a Spotify account, you're not going to go to a different platform to listen to one podcast. No. You're just going to get it all in one place, because that's the app that you use mainly. Are there any costs involved in uploading to multiple platforms, or how does that side of it work? Or is it all free? Or
I mean, obviously the actual platforms don't have a charge, but to use podcast.co, we have a relatively low monthly fee, which is, you pay that. It covers you for one podcast. We have other plans if you want to launch more than one podcast as well, or perhaps you're building podcasts for clients. Yeah. Our platform, again, makes it really straightforward to manage lots of podcasts. You can invite, say, your clients to different accounts so they can access their own podcast and they can't see everyone else's. So it's really, really good if perhaps you're an agency or a production company and you're looking to add this as a service to offer your clients. Yeah. The podcast.co platform has been built with those kind of businesses in mind.
That's really good, because a lot of people who watch our channel do run production companies. Yeah. So podcasting could even be a way, if you're just watching this thinking I could do a podcast for my own business, it could actually be another little revenue stream. Yeah. If you've got 50 clients that you're doing videos for, you could say, hang on a minute, let's get these guys recording a podcast, or to even turn some of the video content into
Absolutely.
podcasts.
I mean, you can easily repurpose video content into podcasts, because ultimately as well, the benefit of podcasts is that you can digest them passively. So if you're uploading YouTube videos, especially if it's lengthy content, you've got to be paying attention to watch it. Whereas podcasts, you can have it on in the car, You can have it on when you're, perhaps in the gym or something like that, and it makes it really straightforward to kind of communicate with people through a different medium. So, but I think my advice to any video production company out there thinking about offering it to their clients would be, speak to us. We can help them formulate a pitch and kind of outline the benefits of, why their clients should start podcasting, and then just offer it, because it's a really good, easy way to perhaps add another revenue stream into your production company. The editing process is exactly the same as editing videos, really. In fact, it's a little bit simpler. There's not as much to think about because you're not worrying about color correction or lighting or anything. So, but it's a growing medium, and certainly we've seen a lot of success. We're doing a lot of production work for clients now as well, ranging from sort of small local businesses through to the biggest client we have at the moment is Samsung. So we've been going over to some conferences in Europe with them, recording some stuff. So at the moment, there's a massive demand for people who are looking for companies to produce podcasts, and they don't. A lot of the time, certainly with brands and kind of corporate clients, they're not interested in doing it in-house. They don't really want to have to learn to edit audio, or they don't really care about how it goes up to Apple iTunes or Apple Podcasts rather, and Spotify, etc. So as a sort of video production company, if you can make that process straightforward, and you can use a platform like podcast.co to manage multiple clients, it's a really good way to sort of add value to your clients and really generate additional revenue for a business.
So yeah, I mean, if you're a video production company and one of your clients may be a fitness instructor, there's only a limited amount of videos you could probably realistically do, whereas if you can convince them to maybe get started on a podcast, they could talk about nutrition or health or fitness tips, motivation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, again, it's potentially another way that client could then say, well, if you're sign up with that person as a personal trainer, I'll give you access to my podcast. So there's loads of different ways you could use it. And we have clients who, for example, law firms. We've got a couple of different clients in law firms. And they are inherently really good public speakers because that's what they do for a living. But it's a great way for them to demonstrate to their customers that they know what they're talking about, and they can kind of dissect court cases after they've been sort of signed out or whatever. And so there's so many different ways you can use it. It doesn't have to just be talking about your products or your services. It's really about kind of conveying useful information that's kind of be relevant to your clients and ultimately demonstrates your kind of knowledge, I think.
Great. Well, thanks, James. So I think that's some great tips there for how to start the podcast and get started recording, editing, and what you should think about when we first get started. In the next video, we're going to be talking more about strategy, what you should actually talk about, what you should do when it comes to maybe growing your audience. So stay tuned for the next video. We'll be back for that soon. If you want to watch the entire playlist, you can click up here. And if you want to see any links to anything we've talked about during the video, you can check that out in the description below. And make sure you leave any comments or questions for James as well, or myself, and we'll get back to every single comment. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.